Hello, and welcome to yet another talk about cooking from someone who doesn't cook. And I don't mean Tim, I mean me. I don't cook, but somehow I keep on ending up making talks about cooking. And so today we're going to be talking about the reassuring joys of sous vide. So I don't know about you all, but on my current device, which is not an M1 Mac, and that's clearly showing today, building even a tiny one-page sample Vue 3 app can take like 3 to 5 seconds to build, and then a few more seconds to update if I make a change. Now, while this increased friction in development may not seem like a huge deal in an isolated context, as it compounds, it can really negatively affect the speed, focus, and enjoyment of the development experience. And this is probably even worse on older and/or less powerful devices. As an example, I remember once working on a Vue app that was deployed in Docker. And that meant that any updates to the code took maybe 30 seconds or so to rebuild, and then the browser had to be refreshed. And so I really dreaded working in that environment because writing even the most trivial changes felt like typing through molasses. So it was from within this type of problem space that Evan Yob started to tire of the burden of time as he worked on Vue apps. He's a busy guy, so, that's how Vite was born. But you might be surprised to hear that this project wasn't always called Vite. So as Evan was working on Vue projects, he became increasingly frustrated with the slow speed at which his updates would apply and be sent to the browser. He'd played around with the idea before of building a faster server that served up a new data type known as ES modules, or ESM, in early 2019. But unfortunately, the technology wasn't that widespread 3 years ago. However, now in 2021, the landscape looks quite different. ESM is supported by all modern browsers, and it's within this context that we're going to discuss the exciting world of sous vide, which modernist cuisine describes as a method of compartmentalizing and cooking ingredients that frees the cook from the tyranny of the clock. This Vite approach is notable because it requires little manual configuration. And the chef doesn't have to worry about the actual process of cooking. It's very hands-off, and it empowers the chef to focus on what to do with the food once it's actually cooked. In other words, Vite empowers us to forget about the time it takes to serve and update an app in development and focus on the coding instead. It also comes with convenient defaults and a simpler configuration system than the Vue CLI. But to better understand why this approach is so powerful, let's take a step back. Imagine that you're a chef at a small restaurant, and you're tasked with creating a complex and custom multi-course meal for your customers. Would you buy a pack of pre-made frozen meals that you could heat up in the microwave? Or would you prefer to get raw ingredients and create something from scratch? Personally, I prefer the pre-cooked meals. They're very convenient, but unfortunately, they often don't offer that much out of the box in terms of flexibility or customization, especially in comparison to cooking from scratch, which allows us to include only that which we find necessary and carefully consider each ingredient. And if you've seen Evan's past talks on the design philosophy of Vue, you know that it's very minimalistic, only what's necessary. So once we've ordered the required raw ingredients, would we serve them directly to the diners uncooked? Or would we process them in some way first? Well, probably if we were chefs worth our salt, we'd cook and combine these raw ingredients to compose cohesive yet creative custom recipes to put on the menu, right? And while the end result might be a single dish, we still probably wouldn't start off our cooking by, I don't know, dumping all of our supplies in one big pile on the counter, right? Because that would be pretty overwhelming and hard to process. In other words, as modern web app and Vue developers, we often build features and even humongous enterprise grade apps, one small compartmentalized file or chunk at a time, using paradigms like single file components to build flexible custom fit solutions that suit our needs. Thanks to modules or reusable chunks of JavaScript, we can even share parts of our code base across the app without having to copy and paste X number of times. Now, up until recently, the primary approach to doing this was enabled by third-party solutions like CommonJS. However, these days, this functionality is supported directly by all modern browsers through a standardized system known as ES modules. And so Vite leverages this new functionality to enable a smoother and faster development experience. But then again, as we said earlier, we wouldn't serve a pile of raw ingredients directly to our customers, right? Like, we can't send files directly to the browser because, for example, Firefox doesn't know what to do with this single file component. So then how do we pre-process our files to send them to the browser so that it's in a format that the browser then can process for us and display to the user? Well, until recently, there was typically like one way that we served our websites, and it was the same both in production and development, in that you wanted to bundle them with a tool like Gulp or Webpack. And that means that you basically smash all the files and packages used in your app into one or a handful of huge files, and then you send them to the browser. And the great thing about this approach is that all the customers have the options they need readily available because we sent them everything. And also on the developer side, we don't have to wait for different user flows to build and load, like if we want to test them manually, for example, because the bundling tool already put in all of that work up front. The disadvantage is that both the building and the serving of the files can be slow, and as you might guess, increasingly slower as the app grows in size. So let's take a moment to ponder this issue. In most restaurants, ours included, we have our daily menu of like staples, like the things that people know we always have and they're coming here for. And we also, of course, have our specials du jour. And if we know that one type of menu item always needs to be available, while the other might be constantly changing and updated based on, I don't know, what's about to go bad in the fridge, would it make sense to shop and prepare for them in the same way? What do you think? No, right? So that's exactly how Vite mitigates slowing down apps build time as it grows larger by using ES Build, which is this really, really fast Go-based bundling tool. And it uses that to take a hybrid approach in development to building our app. So basically, it bundles all of our node modules because those are not likely to change that often, right? So those are all going to be chunked together, and then they're going to be cached in the browser until like basically forever. So they are only going to be updated when we update our dependencies. For our app files, on the other hand, ES Builds transpiles them into individual ES modules, and it sends those to the browser. And the advantage of this approach is that there's basically no wait time between making changes in your app and then those updates hitting the browser, because we're only sending the files that we need, and they all are relatively small. Another nice thing about this approach is that we can almost directly observe the files as sent to the browser in real time, either by keeping an eye on the network tab, or Anthony Fu has this awesome plugin called the Vite plugin inspect library. But remember, just because we can serve our food in chunks doesn't necessarily mean the browser knows what to do with those chunks if they're not in a format that it can ingest. So that's where these plugins come in, because the browser is not going to know like what an SFC is, right? So Vite uses a superset of the rollup bundlers plugin system to transform our single file components and other non-standard formats and import file paths and like less and pug and all of that stuff into modules that our browser can consume. So you can think of plugins like middleware. They'll take an input, which in this case is our app files, and then transform them or take some action that's triggered by those files going through our plugins. So for example, the aforementioned Vue plugin inspects plugin takes our modules and it renders their input and output code on a separate website that you can reference as you are building and developing your Vite app. It also supports Vue through the plugin system as of version 2, and that's how it separates the template, JavaScript, and CSS into separate ES modules. Some other plugins that are common in the Vue workflow include transforming, but not type checking, TypeScript into JavaScript, JSX, if that's your thing, into HTML, and turning preprocessor CSS languages like Sass or less into plain CSS. And the browser can then take these ES modules and turn them into something called module records, which is a format that it knows how to render. The final step in this initial process is to, of course, serve the app to the user. In other words, our computer will send our app to the browser from our local host. And Vite will smartly send only the modules currently requested in the browser. And in parallel, if applicable. So if there's a JS file and there's CSS that goes with it, it'll send those both at the same time. And that minimizes the amount of time it takes to serve files. It also saves time by not transpiling ES6 into older versions of JavaScript, because again, ES modules are only supported by modern browsers. So there's kind of an assumption here that you would not be using ES5 and below. However, if you needed to, there is now a plugin for that as well. And because we don't need to rebuild our node module dependencies after the first time, and we build and serve only the necessary files, Vite will stay fast no matter how large our app grows. In other words, you can expect a fast and smooth developer experience no matter how big or how old your app is. But what happens when we need to update like a small subset of our app? Well, where hot module reloading comes into play. So as we recently discovered, when Vite first built an app, it's doing something with all of our files, right? And the thing that it's doing is it's systematically crawling through all of our files and imports to create this map of our app called the module graph. And this records how all of the files connect to each other. It also notes which modules tend to be imported together, and then it smartly binds them together into their own separate bundles. So that can also help minimize the number of trips that we have to make between the browser and the server to get the data that the website wants. When a module is updated in the IDE, Vite finds where it is in the module graph and lets it know, hey, you need to replace the parts of this file that were updated. Because every module is adult real hard. Like they all know how to update themselves, at least with the Vue plugin. In the case of single file components, the JavaScript and the template and the CSS, they all have their own separate checks to see if you updated those parts of the template. But we can also, if we want, designate our own triggers for when a module should or should not rebuild using the Hmr API. And unlike Vue CLI, which uses Webpack, Vite's Hmr API is this custom object, and you can access it on a global import.meta object. You can also use this API to determine whether a module should even allow itself to be updated by like another component or another module, like maybe they don't know each other, or whether it should dispose of the update, whether we want to maintain the state when we update the component from before we made a change, and finally, whether we want to invalidate an update entirely. So in theory, then hot module reloading means that our page should never have to reload, right? Well, if you've used this feature before, you're probably aware that that's not always the case. Times when a full reload are required include the aforementioned invalid update, also if you update the application root, or if there's just, an error updating a module. But again, because we don't need to reload or rebuild all of our module dependencies, like the node stuff, that's huge. And because we're using ESBuild to build our app files and transpile and send only the modules that are currently being requested, not any of the other ones that happen to be related. Even a full page reload shouldn't take that long. Also, in development, if you update a module or a ref or some other JavaScript data that multiple components depend on, all of those components will be rebuilt and refetched. And then if there's components in between those, they will be recreated and remounted, but we're not going to fetch that data again because we know that that hasn't changed. And once we're ready to push to production, it's time to finally build the Vite app, which is not done with ESBuild, but instead with Rollup. This is because Rollup has been around for longer and therefore has more and more stable configuration options. Another really nice thing about Rollup from my brief experience working with it is that the docs, they seem really friendly, especially for bundler docs. I'm not naming any names, but I feel like especially if you don't know a lot about that stuff, it can seem very intense. And they include a lot of foundational definitions in line as you're reading their guides and their different articles. So I thought that that was really helpful. And since Vite plugins are a superset of the Rollup plugin system, that means that these nice docs and existing Rollup content can also help you understand and develop your own libraries for Vite. But wait a minute, why do we need to build? Haven't I been saying this whole time that ES modules are way faster? I mean, it's true that in the development experience, ESM results in like a huge quality of life upgrade. And that's because it keeps the amount of data transferred back and forth between the browser and the dev server, which is your computer. So it's like right there. It keeps that amount of data transferred really small. But in production, this could potentially be like a ton of calls back and forth between your user's browser and the server, which could be like who knows where. And so, if they need to fetch a million things, then that could noticeably slow down the loading of your website. So while the old way of smashing everything into a single bundle can slow down our progress in development, when it comes to building for production, it's still the ideal way to get ready for release. But that being said, don't worry about your performance stuttering in production, as Vite will automatically code split your app, including the CSS. It does this in development, but it does it in prod too. And so that is just about all of the basics of how Vite works that contrast with the Vue CLI experience. So how does one get started building a Vite app? Well, you can go to vitejs.dev and either click on the Stack Blitz links in the Getting Started guide that Evan mentioned earlier, or you could run one of the package manager CLI commands. But if you really want to, if you already know what libraries you want to use, like let's say you're like, oh, I already know I want to use Shocker or something, then I recommend that you check out the starter templates in the awesome Vite repo. Like I always thought these things were just for really cool projects. I didn't realize they had starter stuff in there, and I wish I knew earlier because I had a lot of trouble finding the compatible version of, for example, Element.io that worked with Vite and Vue 3. And so I wish that I had seen the starter template in awesome Vite before I put in the time and work to figure out my own way of getting it to work. Once you're there, though, like the development experience should be smooth sailing because, it's still Vue we're working in. And there's also a lot of overlap between the two build tools. For example, they handle environment variables in pretty much the exact same way, just like, the prefix is Vite instead of Vue, and static assets are also handled very similarly. But, if you want to learn more about Vite or about build tools in general, Here's a list of resources that I found helpful, and I will also paste them into the conference chat after my talk. Finally, before we go, I'd like you all to join me in my favorite Vue-themed breathing exercise to help our minds focus and relax and ingest what we learned today. So everyone close your eyes and breathe in. And as you breathe in, think events up. As you breathe out, think props down. Breathe in, events up. Breathe out, props down. One last time, breathe in, events up. And finally, props down. So, food. Vite is a bundling tool and dev server that uses ES-build in development and rollup in production, and is very, 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 very fast. It enables you to focus on speed of typing, front-end development, and thought over tooling and configuration. And honestly, after trying it, I don't think that I can go back because it is just really that instantaneous. With that, merci et bon appétit.
Tess with the French, let's go.
Yeah. Tessa, he was asleep a second ago.
Yeah, I was like breathing in, breathing out, and I was like, someone wake me up in a bit, you know, so I totally needed that. Well, you know, bon appétit, merci bien, that was so kind of you.
And I have to say, best slides ever.
Yeah.
They're just incredible. Like shout out to Tessa, please.
I mean, definitely. First of all, can we get some claps, please? I'm not in the chat, I should be.
Yeah, I can see them. They're clapping. She's
right.
getting a lot of love in there.
All right, you know, I remember last few slides too that were absolutely bonkers.
Yeah.
You know,
You have a talent. You could sell those.
You know, so, but glad you could join us. I heard, you know, about the technical difficulties. So, obviously,
that's what you do when you go live,
that,
right?
Yeah,
but it's
exactly,
more fun,
man.
you know. Let's be.
I mean, yeah. Apparently, you owed the internet god some money, so they kind of shook you down and got this money back and put you back online.
Yeah.
That's how it works.
Yeah, pretty much.
You know, so, but listen, I'd love to get into some more Q&A or something, but that's where the sessions are about, right?
Yeah.
So we're going to get into the sessions, send you off there, but hopefully we'll be able to chat a little later during the after party or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, Tessa, you got karaoke with me later, right?
Absolutely. That's the only reason I can. I'm kidding.
Okay, there you go. Well, I love you too, Tessa. You know, so. But we're going to send you off to the sessions right now, and we're actually going to jump back into a